Catherine the Great, Chapter 7. Paul opened the next diary and scanned its pages. They were full of carefully kept records, Catherine's working hours, the people she has summoned to see her, the books she read. He opened another diary, and another. They were all the same, thousands of words recording what his mother had done for the people of Russia. He noticed that although there were records of trade and military agreements, the honors given and the delegations received of ambassadors appointed and dismissed, the topic that had driven his mother and which he occupied as much greater proportion of her time than any other was her work on Russia's new legal system. Nearly every day carried an entry. He imagined the middle-aged Catherine tired at the end of her day's work, perhaps even propped up in bed, writing the day's events and progress before sleeping. Obviously, even her travels had not prevented her from writing in her diary. And he came across an entry written in the city of Kazan. Kazan, May 1st, 1767. The people here have given me a great welcome, and the city of Kazan itself is impressive. It seems to have an efficient city council to keep the place moving. Europe and Asia meet here. This is evident everywhere in the town. There are as many mosques as churches. Panyan has been telling me for years that cities on the rivers, as Kazan is, are important to the Russian economy. I can see why now. At the reception today, the mayor of the city told me that the Volga carries over half of all Russia's internal trade goods. I think he is boasting a little, but even so the figure must be high judging from the river traffic, the cargo boats and barges. It has all made me look at the new legal system. I've been working on a difficult light. I can see that I'm going to have to take more account of the great diversity of the people. I will mean yet another subcommittee of the Legislative Commission, I suppose. I wish I did not involve so many people. It takes so long and bureaucrats like to spend their time just arguing instead of getting things done. I have a good mind to dismiss them all and do not myself if I did not need them as lawyers and legal experts. I'd do that. At the sound of the study door opening, Paul turned to see his wife, in her black morning clothes, enter. He rose to meet her and held out his hand. She clasped it in greeting. "Maria," he said. "You've been in here for hours, Paul," she said. "What are you doing?" "Reading family history," he replied. "How's mother?" "Every minute I think she can't possibly last another, but somehow she does." "Have you been with her all that time?" She nodded. "But you should come. I'm sure the others are wondering why you're not with her." "I'll come now, Maria. It's quiet here in mother's study. You could lie down here for a while. You need to rest too. Would you like me to call something to eat for you?" "No, Paul. There is nothing I want now. But I will rest a while. You go see your mother." Leaving his wife to rest, Paul made his way through the quiet, darkened passageways and the corridors of the palace to Catherine's apartment. He remembered as he walked the time his mother had gone on the journey to see the empire. In fact, she had not seen much of it, even though she had traveled as far as Kazan, further than most of Russian tsars and emperors who had reigned before her. Paul had been 13 then. He asked several times if he could go with her. She refused outright. He had not even considered his request. Paul had been stuck in Moscow with his tutors and his lessons, bored and resentful. He wrote to her, and occasionally she wrote to him. Letters were full of exciting things she'd seen on her travels. This made him more resentful, until he was angry enough to tear up the letters without bothering to read them. These thoughts continued as he entered the room where Catherine lay, and stood in the gloom, looking at her dying frame. What kind of mother had she been? And what kind of son had he been? After her refusal to take him on her journey, her sudden attentiveness to him when she returned came as a surprise. She was to make a major speech to the Legislative Council, he learned, and he was to accompany her and stand by her side in a show of solidarity. Even at 13 years old, he could see that his mother he was a kind of stage prop, to be used and exhibited on a few special events when she needed him with her. He was hardly a son to her at all. The occasions on which she needed him grew more frequently as he grew older. He recalled the declaration of war against Turkey. She had wanted him there then as a show that she was preparing her son to take over when she died. He remembered the long, polished conference table surrounded by 10 men of the Council of Military Advisers, the tenseness of the atmosphere, and the knowledge of all of them that Catherine had already made up her mind, and she wanted a war, and there was a little that anyone would dare say to oppose her. Grigory Orlov was there, and Panin, of course, who began the discussion. This business of a few Russian Cossacks violating the Turkish-Russian border is just an excuse to get border negotiations going again now that the Turks think they are in the strong position. Their economy has done well in the last 5 years, and now they're buying arms from the French as fast as they can. They may have better weapons, Panin, replied Catherine, but Russian soldiers are second to none. We can win any fight they choose to start. Perhaps war can be avoided altogether, broke in Orlov. Just because the Turks are arming does not necessarily mean they want a war. Everyone stared at him. It was surprising that Orlov, a soldier himself, and usually ready for military action, should take this position. Paul had seen Catherine fix him with her steady gaze. Was he questioning her? Are you losing your nerve, Grigory? No, Your Highness, but for Russia, a war will be expensive. We will have no move large numbers of troops south. In the part of our country, the men will not be able to live off the land. We will have to establish heavy supply lines just to keep them fed and supplied. It makes our eventual success less likely. Panin glanced at Catherine's face and saw which way his Empress' mind was working. I believe we should begin to move those troops and establish those supply lines then, he said. Russia should be first to attack, before the Turks are entirely prepared. This suggestion met with general approval. All of the council members nodded their heads in agreement. Paul had seen Orlov's face show the realization that he had spoken against Catherine's real wishes. Whatever we do, their troops will outnumber ours 3-1, he said quietly, and then he paused and leaned forward. Do not mistake my comments for hesitation. I only suggest that if we must go to war, we use our naval forces first. Catherine smiled. Paul could see that this was more to her liking. Go on, Grigory, she told him. We can take our fleet into the Mediterranean and attack Turkey's coastal cities. While the Turks are occupying with that, we can strike them from the north with our ground forces. Voices around the table rose as this idea was debated with general approval. Paul recalled that the Russo-Turkish War, as it came to be known, began when the winter broke in 1769. After March of that year, Russia mounted one victorious attack after another. To celebrate Russia's victories, Catherine held balls and parties to which she was always careful to invite the representatives of European countries. Their governments, perhaps too easily impressed with reports of Russia's military and naval might, grew increasingly anxious. The astuteness of Catherine's politics was not lost in Paul. He understood that she was consolidating her empire, both militarily and through those reports that the European diplomats sent to her governments psychologically as well. Paul stood there in the room with his dying mother, the priest still softly chanting his prayers, the darkness thick with the smell of incense. His mind was lost in the past, full of what his mother had been like, when suddenly he was startled out of the thoughts by a cry from the lady-in-waiting, who was standing closest to the bed. Catherine had opened her eyes. There was a flurry of movement. The doctor had moved quickly forward, but Catherine gently closed her eyes again and slept on. Her son sighed, wondered how much longer it would last. He turned away and quietly left the room to make his way once more to his mother's study. Maria was gone when he got there. He presumed she had returned to her own apartment to lie down for a while, or perhaps she had gone back to a depressing deathbed scene. Paul looked once more at his mother's diaries. Moscow, January 9th, 1771. If Russia's doctors worked together as well as Russian soldiers, we wouldn't be in this position. Shafovsky insists that a man he treated in November died from a bubonic plague. Rinder insists that it was not a bubonic plague at all. I suspect that this is not really a matter of medical opinion, but due to the fact that Shasovsky is Russian and Rinder is German. They do not trust each other. Now I am told that 13 people have died in Moscow from the Black Death. That's 13 if they are telling me the truth, which they rarely do in such matters. I shall wait to see what Saltykov reports. As a 17-year-old, Paul had been sent to live in Petrograd for the whole of 1771. He remembered the servants in the charge of the estate there, isolating the place from the outside world. It was the only way they knew to protect the young prince from being infected by the plague. The Empress herself stayed in St. Petersburg and governed from there. The pages of Catherine's journal from 1771 were interleaved. With a large number of letters, Paul opened one and saw the signature. It was the Petro Saltykov. As a historian, Paul had heard of the man. He had been a public servant in charge of the government measures to control the outbreak of the Black Death in Moscow. Paul removed the letters from between the pages of the diary. He laid them out in chronological order, unfolding them as he progressed. As he did so, he noticed that the writing abruptly changed at the end of August. Saltykov disappeared, and in its place was Lieutenant General Pyotr Yerobkin. All of the letters took the form of reports. They were short and very much to the point. Moscow, January 15th. Your Highness, preliminary reports suggest that the illness from which 25 people died between Christmas 1770 and January 7, 1771 is indeed the Black Death. It seems it started from a textile factory in the middle of the manufacturing district that had been imported a large quantity of woolen clothes from Austria, from where it will be remembered the plague was reported last year. I have ordered the closure and burning of this factory. There have been no deaths since January 7th. However, I would urge caution in drawing conclusions about this. It is known that the plague increases its effectiveness in warmer weather. The spring is approaching. The Austrian ambassador has told me that he believes the excess of 21,000 died in Austria through the spring and summer of 1769. Saltykov. Moscow, January 17th. Your Highness, I have convened a meeting of dozen doctors from St. Petersburg and Moscow as an advisory panel to provide planning for an outbreak of the plague in our major cities. Saltykov. St. Petersburg, February 10th. Your Highness, I regret to report that although I have urged action at every possible opportunity, no panel of doctors has met, nor have agreements of any kind been made. Saltykov. St. Petersburg, February 10th. Your Highness, by threatening arrest for non-attendance, I have ordered a convention of doctors advisory panel. The doctors will meet on February 20th at St. Petersburg. In the letters to me, all have expressed the opinion that such a meeting is a waste of time, because nothing we can do will prevent the outbreak. Nevertheless, I have insisted that the doctors meet. Saltykov. St. Petersburg, February 20th. Your Highness, the panel of doctors has met. All are of the opinion that the plague is spread by the existence of unhealthy smells and vapors that arise from the piles of rubbish and rotting foodstuffs abandoned on the streets. To deal with this problem will involve the mayor and the city workers. The mayor asks where the money will be found to cope with this extra work. He will not undertake to organize the removal of rubbish until I can tell him how such money will be paid. I have formulated a plan to block off and so isolate the parts of the city we judge most likely to suffer from an outbreak. Saltykov. March 2nd. Your Highness, there are reports of an outbreak of the plague in Moscow, in the Leforantov district. I have ordered the district to be blocked off. As you suggested, I have spoken with Count Orlov. He says he will provide men of Russian Guards regiment to enforce his blockade. Saltykov. March 10th. Your Highness, I must report that 12 men have died in the Leforantov district as a result of the plague. I have strengthened the blockade of the area. Measures are underway to remove the piles of rubbish from the streets. The contribution of funds from the Royal Treasury has made this work possible, and the people of Moscow are immeasurably grateful for Your Highness for her efforts on their behalf. Saltykov. March 12th. Your Highness, I must offer you my profound apologies. Councillor Danilov and the leading council of Leforatovo district has been falsifying reports, most especially his course of the dead. It seems that the real figure citizens have died from the latest outbreak is closer to 60 than the figure of 31, which was reported to Your Highness on March 10th. However, I have no accurate figures yet. Councillor Danilov has been removed from his position. Saltykov. April 2nd. Your Highness, as you have commanded, all the textile factories have been closed. Some are beginning used as quarantine stations to house plague victims. The time is taking for those infected to die has shortened from an average of 4 days. As the beginning of March to less than 3 days, at the present time, 3 or 4 citizens are dying each day. Our total now stands of 181. Just over one third of these are infants. I am confident that this is an accurate figure. Saltykov. April 17th. Your Highness, Total deaths from the plague now stand at 212, although approximately 4 or 5 deaths continue to occur each day. I believe we are containing the outbreak. I have increased the numbers of quarantine stations. Saltykov. Although there was a change in style and signature at the point of in late July, when Saltykov disappeared to be replaced by Lieutenant General Pyotr Yoropkin. The reports for the rest of April, May, June, July, and August continued in much the same tone. Paul read them with increasing skepticism for the whole of spring and summer 1771. A short note was carried almost every day for Moscow to Catherine in St. Petersburg. All said much the same things, that the outbreak of the plague had been contained, that the numbers of deaths were steady, that hospitals and quarantine houses were coping with the problems. That was a business as usual in Russia's oldest and most populated city. Paul knew that this could not be true. His interest in reading about the history of his own country told him that towards the end of the summer of 1771, there had been a major problems on the streets of Moscow. Public resentments of the way Saltykov and Yoropkin handled the crisis and resulted in riots that became known as the Plague Revolt. For 3 days, rioters had run wild in the streets and destroyed quarantine stations, police stations, and roadblocks. Most members of the nobility had left Moscow to live in their country estates, intending to wait out the time of the plague, remained in Moscow and leaving only a few servants to look after their city houses. These servants had been attacked and in some cases killed. The houses had been looted and burned. There had been too few police and soldiers in Moscow to keep order. The mobs had occupied the streets, stealing from shops and houses and setting up checkpoints to protect their own neighborhoods. The Archbishop of Moscow himself was killed by an angry mob when he insisted on removing a religious icon from one of the city's gateways where crowds had gathered to pray. The riots had only ended when Catherine sent her old favorite Grigory Orlov to Moscow with 4 regiments of Russian Imperial Guards. But Paul knew that had not been until in late September. Orlov had become a hero for the things he had done. He had issued public proclamations admitting to the people that 2 kinds of plague were acting in the city. He organized a special city council to hear people's complaints, and he ordered people to take preventive measures like taking frequent baths and wearing clothes that had been soaked in vinegar. Paul threw aside note after note from Saltykov and Pyotr Yoropkin. They were all full of lies designed to keep the Empress happy and isolated from Moscow in her St. Petersburg retreat. But together they showed a growing desperation and about how such a crisis could be handled. At last, he came across 2 pieces a hand he had recognized, Orlov's. There was a short note and a longer report. Paul opened the note first. Moscow, September 27th. Madam, I write in a haste. Moscow is a scene of fear, chaos, and panic. The common people have taken to the streets and are rioting in the main thoroughfares. Looters are running out of control and are even going through the pockets of dead who lie rotting and stinking on every street corner. City and church officials who asked for calm are being murdered. Houses are being burned. No food is to be found in the city, not even to feed the children. From among the few army units already here, I have organized teams of workers to burn the corpses. I expect at least one of the regiments of guards to arrive today. Our first task will be to stop the riots. I shall write again as soon as I have news. G. Orlov. Moscow, October 6th. Madam, firstly, my apologies for not having written sooner. Only now do I have the leisure, and find myself the possessor of such complete and full knowledge of the situation, to find it possible to write an accurate report. It seems the first protests against the measures undertaken by Saltykov and later by Europkin took place as early as August 29th. Certainly by the 1st or 2nd of September, the rumors of rebellion against the authorities were already everywhere in the city. On September 15th, great masses of Muscovites began to flow towards the Red Square. They overpowered the military personnel there and burst into the Kremlin. On September 16th, the rioting crowds grew in numbers and determination. They killed several religious leaders who were appealing for calm and destroying the quarantine zone in the Danilov monastery and another near the Sherpukov gates. Again, at the Kremlin, they demanded the surrender of Europkin, whom it is reported they intended to hang. The few soldiers at the Kremlin opened fire with small shot. This scattered the crowd and averted the immediate crisis. A few of the ringleaders of the mobs were captured and imprisoned. Early in the morning on September 17th, a mob of about 900 to 1,000 poor citizens gathered in the Red Square again. They demanded the release of their commanders and the elimination of the quarantine stations. The soldiers defending the Kremlin fired again and managed to disperse the crowd a second time. Between September 17th and September 26th, when I arrived, the city was at a complete standstill. There were no factories or business open. There was no work for people, no operating transport, and no available food. The dead were to be found lying where they fell, in all the public parts of the city. As may be imagined, the rat population was quite out of control. Madam, I have instigated a government commission to control of the city. We had opened the factories again to provide some work and have imported some grain for making bread for the countryside around Moscow. We have also reopened the public baths and the markets to a large extent that this has quietened the people and has taken the mobs off the streets. We cannot abandon the quarantine stations, but our work in improving the conditions inside continues. We have offered payments of money to those who know that some member of their family has the plague and who are willing to undergo voluntary quarantine. Since the trials of those considered to be the ringleaders of the riots, 4 have been hanged, 165 adults and 10 children are serving prison sentences. Of great regret, madam, in fact, that I must report that a figure of just over 20,000 of your Moscow citizens have so far died of the plague. Deaths continue, but the numbers are falling. The approaching cold winter weather will give some respite. Orlov. Paul glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece above the fire. It was just after 2. He had to think hard to recall the date, November 7th. That was it. He stood and stretched himself. He knew that his duty in his mother's apartment, where she lay dying, but the thought of going there repelled him. He found the whole thing a sham, a kind of play act out for the benefit of what would be written later, rather than any real show of pity or respect. The heavy gloom of the apartment, with its dark wall hangings and tapestries, The two or three scented candles that provided so little light, the cloying smell of incense, and the priest's drowning voice, and the servants, visibly weary and longing to lie down, and someone recording it all. That was what Paul found most irritating. Even his own movements that day were being recorded for the sake of written history that would come, and perhaps be rewritten several times in later years to take into account new historical opinions of Catherine's as the years and decades passed. It was all so false. He moved across the room to the door and quietly opened it. The passage was poorly lit, but he could see a footman standing at the end. The man yawned and shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Paul was about to call him to send him on some errand that would at least remove his boredom from a minute or two, but he changed his mind. He took in the intense stillness and quiet of the scene. There were no voices to be heard anywhere. The palace was holding its breath, waiting for a moment in history to pass. Paul closed the door again and crossed for the fireplace. He took some wood from the box and placed it on the fire, prodding it into place with a steel poker. Then he took off his jacket and tie. He gathered up the next pile of diaries and other papers and sat with them on a settee near the desk, where the light from the candles was still bright and good. He pushed off his shoes without unlacing them and kicked them to one side. Then he put his feet on the settee and began to read his mother's diary for 1772. St. Petersburg, January 12, 1772. I've never met such a stuck-up little prig. Still, I am not surprised the Prussian ambassador should be such a person. He is, after all, Prussian Fred's brother, Prince Henry, he calls himself, all puffed up in his own importance in that foolish velvet suit he wears. And as for him being here to consolidate the peace and goodwill between our two great nations, I never heard such rubbish. Frederick hasn't sent him all this way. Neither do I believe what he says about completing the arrangements for Wilhelmina to travel here. The arrangements were finished weeks ago, and away what is there to arrange? The girl will come, and if I think she's strong enough, she'll marry Paul. But I shall see tomorrow what Henry wants, in his very self-important way. He has asked for half an hour audience tomorrow afternoon. The reference to Wilhelmina startled Paul. He rarely thought about his first wife, although the mention of her now brought an unexpected wave of emotion. Suddenly, it occurred to him how different his own relationship had been from his parents. He had really loved Wilhelmina, and had continued to call her by her childhood name after they were married, and she had adopted the Russian name Natalia. She had loved him too. They had fallen for each other the day they met, when she had arrived at the Winter Palace after her long journey from Germany with her mother and two younger sisters. Paul remembered to the panic-stricken night, the doctors and the midwives rushing here and there, the urgent instructions from Catherine herself, the morning that dawned grey and still and cold, like Ludmila herself, and the child who had died with her, lost to him forever. Paul gazed at the fire for a few moments, his thoughts lost in his own past. How different it might have been if Wilhelmina had lived, if the child had lived. At length, with a conscious effort, he turned his thoughts back to the present. Tucked in the binding of the diary were the 3 letters. As he opened the first, Paul recognized the Imperial Treasury crest at the head of the page and the Treasury Secretary Kirecki's handwriting. His mother's hand had added at the bottom, received Jan 12. Moscow, January 10th, 1772. Your Highness, towards the end of 1771, the treasurer approached me with some concerns about the treasury accounts for the coming year. Together, he and I have been examining the accounts, and I have to report his concerns to you now. Rising income from confiscated church lands, the process of which Your Highness began in 1764 and continues, has been effective in restoring the flow of money to the levels that can sustain ordinary government expenditure. The 8 new warships Your Highness has commissioned are being built to their target dates and will be in the service as planned in the spring of 1773. Expenditures for these vessels are itemized in the quarterly treasury report due at the end of the March. However, it is the war with Turkey that is taking a disproportionate toll on Russia's resources. The cost of the horse breaking and training alone has exceeded the income from the taxes raised in towns east of Volga, and 14 new cannon Your Highness has ordered to support the advanced regiments and to consolidate Russian positions within Turkey have met manufacturing difficulties, and their cost will rise, possibly by as much as a third. Moreover, the delivery date for the weapons will be delayed over a month. The cannon will not reach our soldiers in Turkey until at least the end of February. I must respectfully draw Your Highness' attention to the depleted state of Russian treasury that has come about through the continuance of a war which, while it is true brings glory to the Russian army, gains us almost no territory we can hold, no income from which we can profit, and stretches our resources to their very limits. Nikolai Kirecki, Treasury Secretary. The second letter was quite informal. At first, Paul thought it was a diary entry that had been added in, but then he saw that it was a draft of a letter. The addendum with the date at the bottom indicating that Catherine must have begun to write to her secretary-chief, Panin, but had been interrupted. Then she must have somehow lost the letter among the papers on her desk, and later written and sent a replacement. Eventually, she must have found this copy and kept it. St. Petersburg. Panin, it's not often we get a chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. No matter how he tries to dress it up in diplomatic language, Prussian Fred is as greedy as ever. I can see through him so easily, sending his brother here to pretend concern and to ask if we need any help with our struggle against Turkey. Really, does he think I'm a child? He's spying to find out how we are paying for the war. All those remarks over dinner about the cost keeping men at arms, they were not for nothing. I left him in no doubt that we are easily coping with the costs. We've got them worried in Europe. I can see that now. They must be talking about Russia at every conference they have. But his proposal about Poland, now that really is interesting. If Austria and Prussia are going to carve up Poland between them, then Russia should help them. Militarily, the Poles are weak, and disorganized. I have cost us almost nothing to take and control the eastern end of the country. We even have a regiment claiming to the land. Many of the peasants there speak Russian, and wasn't the whole area within Russia territory less than 300 years ago? The land is fertile and will pay for our war in Turkey with some to spare. I want you to immediately contact Orlov and tell him to raise 4 new regiments. Don't worry about the cost. This venture will pay for itself many times over. And don't worry about protests from Kiretsky either. I will speak to him and keep him mollified. He written and not finished, and to finish first. 1401-72. The third letter was from Panin to Catherine. Paul recognized the handwriting immediately, and expected it to be a direct reply to Catherine's instructions to head a security on the subject of Poland, but he was wrong. It concerned a different matter altogether. Moscow, February 1st, 1772. Madam, much as I realize it will cause you some distress, I have to report that several rumors are circulating among the nobility in both Moscow and St. Petersburg to the effect that the Orlov brothers have took advantage of the great freedom you allowed to Grigory when he took charge in Moscow during the time of the plague. It is said that they made vast profits by selling food at inflated prices to the detriment of the people. The truth or falsity of these rumors is not so important as the fact that they are widely believed. The result in that the Orlov family is rapidly losing favor among the nobility and the people alike. The general opinion is that the honors you have given the Orlovs are undeserved and that they have too much influence at court. My advice is that your Highness should distance herself from the Orlovs without delay. Panin. There was a large gap in the records. Nevertheless, when Paul turned the page, he expected to see something concerning Grigory Orlov, but again, he was wrong. He realized that almost a year passed during which no diary entries were made. He sat up from his longing position on the city and sorted through the pile of letters and papers. There was a large flat parcel tied with string, intriguingly. It had no date, only C plus D written on it in large letters. My mother's hand, Paul thought. Although the size of the letters distorted the writing, making it impossible to say for sure, he sorted the papers further. Soon his hand fell on a small bundle of 8 or 9 letters, some still in their envelopes. Catherine had tied them together with thin dark ribbon and labeled them 1772. Paul untied the parcel and saw that the letters were in French, English, and Spanish. He opened the one written in French, the language other than Russian he understood best. Paris, September 8, 1772. Madam, as a remark of common respect and very good will that exists between our two Christian nations, it is customary at this time of the year to wish your Highness and the Russian nobility a joyful remembrance of the birth date of our Lord Jesus Christ. Here convey those wishes. However, our happy Christian greetings are tempered because we must also convey to your Highness, the Empress of all Russia, our dismay over your country's actions in Poland. His Gracious Majesty Louis XV, the French government and the people of France see your annexing of Polish lands as an unnecessarily aggressive act. We consider it similar to cannibalism in that you are eating your brothers and sisters, the nobility of Poland. Duke de Villeroy. Paul had known that the Duke de Villeroy in various ways. He had been in service on the French royal family for many years. He had been Louis's tutor and later his ambassador to the Russian court. Parts of the cold familiarity of the letter was the fact that Duke Villeroy had addressed it as coming from Paris when he had been living in the ambassador's residence in St. Petersburg at the time. Obviously, Catherine's adventures in Poland, while they may have helped to balance the books at the Russian treasury, had been most unpopular in Europe. A glance at the other letters showed Paul they were all much the same. While he understood English very poorly and Spanish not at all, he could see that the letters from those countries' ambassadors were short and disapproving. He did not bother with them further, but turned back to the diary, interested mainly in anything his mother had to say about Wilhelmina. St. Petersburg, September 9th, 1772. Natalia reminds me of myself at her age, but without my disadvantage of having a fool for a prospective husband. She and Paul seem to care about each other. Good. And she has a sense of humor, but it is important that she is boldly healthy and strong, more than anything else. The succession needs to be assured. Paul needs an heir. She seems intelligent enough to teach something about the government. However, when I have time to talk to her, I don't know. Perhaps I'll write to her. Learn Russian language, Russian history and traditions, stay out of debt, stay out of politics, and respect your husband. For the first time since he had begun to read, Paul burst out with laughter. Obviously, the last bit of the diary entry was a reminder of Catherine had written to herself about things that she intended to advise Wilhelmina on, with his mother certainly did not believe in following her own advice. Although she had thoroughly learned the Russian language, traditions, and history, she had entirely disregarded three of her own rules. He allowed himself to pause for a while to enjoy the moment. A letter from Panyan slipped from the diary as he turned the page. Catherine's note at the bottom indicated that she had received it on September 10th. Moscow, September 8th, 1772. Madam, I interviewed Grigory Orlov and have given him your messages. He took the news badly, as we both expected. He accepted your gift of 500 serfs to work on his estate, but refused the offer of 2,000 rubles a year for retiring. He insists that he will not retire for public life under any circumstances. For the time being, at least, I have agreed that he can remain with the 3 government committees on which he serves so long as he makes no public statements and keeps himself out of the public gaze. Indeed, madam, this is probably the best outcome for which we could have wished. There is no doubt that Orlov is an efficient and valuable member of your government. I feel that it would be really loss were he to entirely leave. Panyan, received September 10th. Paul noted the meaning contained in Panyan's use of the plural messages and his following discussion of the single matter of Orlov's leaving government service. Obviously, another message had been given to Orlov that was not then discussed. Also, Paul realized that was seeing a glimpse of Panyan's expertise as a politician. Knowing and understanding his empress's strong feelings for Grigory Orlov and security chief must have had to deal carefully with the situation. He was trying to get rid of Grigory Orlov, but making it look as if he supported him at the same time. Paul glanced at his mother's diary. St. Petersburg, September 10, 1772. It is the end of the last of my girlish dreams. I must remain married only to Russia now. End of chapter 7.